What is up, everyone? I'm Ryan from Fireside Knicks with my friend and co-host Dylan Backer, and in today's video, we are doing the report card series with the center position. Now, obviously, there's not the same amount of players to talk about with wings or guards, so this is gonna be a little bit of a shorter one. But there's still these three guys were still pretty integral for what the Knicks did all season. And your ability to establish interior dominance is really, it depends, and it's predicated on your center position. But with that being said, the Knicks, their starter this season was Mitchell Robinson. He's been the starter for a while. He's one of the longest tenured Knicks, if I'm not mistaken, on this roster. And he turned in another pretty solid season. Obviously there was that stretch where he got hurt, and that's kind of always been the Mitchell Robinson experience. Good when healthy, but that when healthy is a large asterisk. I feel like he's one of the most interesting players, not just in this video, but out of all the players we've gotten to grade so far, he's one of the most interesting players to grade because the highs with Mitchell Robinson, when he came back from injury, right? The team just became so much better in the interior. But you also realize that there are a lot of offensive limitations with Mitch. He can't space the floor. That's obviously a big one. He's not, gonna go out there and drop 20 points a game. That's not what Mitch does. Obviously a liability at the free throw line. But you're gonna talk about this with the offensive rebounding. There are things he does extremely well. There are things he does extremely poorly. But I feel like overall it was a positive season for Mitchell Robinson. What grade did you give Mitchell Robinson this season? And how would you summarize his year?
Right, so, you look at Mitchell Robinson and you don't think really like a best center in the league type guy. We all know that, but, for the Knicks, he's been good for us. Obviously, like you said, there's the floor spacing stuff that you want to worry about and stuff like that. But for what it's worth, Mitch is still a productive big man. And for that, I gave him a B, kind of B plus range, more like a B. And the reason I gave him more like a B is because, there were times where he would struggle defensively. And, of course, the offensive limitations would hurt the offense. But what gave me extra points for him was just the offensive rebounding specifically. I mean, the guy led the league in offensive rebounds per game at 4.5. He was really, really effective at that. He was easily the best offensive rebounder in the NBA. Big reason why the Knicks were able to be one of the league leaders in second chance points. That was a huge thing right there because this Knicks offense wasn't necessarily good. We know that even with how good Jalen Brunson and Julius Randle were, as a team, they were not a very good offense. But Mitchell Robinson's contributions, on the offensive glass were huge, and a big reason why we were able to get those second chance points and be a little bit better offensively, even if we weren't very good offensively as it was. So I think a B plus is fair. A very good shot blocker, as we all know, but sometimes, he would get those bad feet, struggle to guard, floor spacing bigs, and he would get into foul trouble. Those are things that he can clean up, though, in the offseason. Those are things he can work on, with his coaches, his trainers, and all that stuff, which I'm hoping he does in the offseason, because sometimes he'll post those videos of him shooting threes, and I don't want him shooting threes, obviously, but that's just, just a little joke right there. But, jokes aside, just, really positive season for Mitch. This was his first season on a contract extension, 4 years, $60 million, I think they signed in the offseason, and they got good value out of it. I think they did. He was very impactful big for what it was worth, and, I just think it was a good season for him. I don't think it was anything like, oh my God, this is amazing, he's the best center in the planet. No, of course not, but, I do think they did need him more than they didn't need him. Like you said, when he was hurt, you felt his presence not there. You felt just that interior force that he is. 7'2", big guy, good shot blocking, good rebounding. Like I said, you felt it not there. Then when he came back, you felt it right away. All the rebounds that you were missing out on, all those block shots, all those second chance opportunities, and in the playoffs too. He played against Jared Allen and Evan Mobley. That is not an easy task whatsoever, and he dominated them, quite frankly. He dominated them on the glass, especially. He's the type of guy where his box score is not exactly an alarming thing, but if you watch the game and see how he impacts it, then it's huge. You'll notice how good of a center he actually is. Yes, his fit on the Knicks is, a little weird, because like you said, the floor spacing thing, you have a bunch of guys that specialize in scoring inside, and Mitch is a primarily inside player, of course. He almost never is a perimeter guy, so, of course, that's going to affect the floor spacing. It's not exactly Mitch's fault. That's just kind of roster construction. That's why, you have off seasons and why you try to improve the roster and try to improve also these players' skill sets. But with that being said, just aside from all that, really positive season for Mitch. I think a B plus is fair. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. And, one of the big things you mentioned with the offensive rebounding, I was not aware of this until, I did some, research for this episode. When he was on the court, the Knicks had a 121.8 offensive rating. When he was off the court, it was 116.4. That offensive rebounding, it mattered, right? It's not one of those things where it's like, oh, that's an arbitrary stat leading the league in offensive rebounds. No, 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 no. Those second chance points matter, right? And as you mentioned, this Knicks offense, not that they're bad, they're just not very efficient, right? And it reflects in like true shooting percentage and 3-point percentage. They got more efficient when they acquired Josh Hart. They got more efficient when they were healthy. But on the season, they were not a very efficient offense. We saw that in the postseason get exposed a little bit. They just weren't a very efficient offense. That's something they're going to look to improve over the offseason. But Mitch's ability to just establish that interior presence, that Cavs series, again, he made Jared Allen go to the public and say the lines were brighter than I expected. He babied that man. When you're matched up against Allen and Mobley, and, not that Julius Randle is the worst defensive player in the world, but Julius Randle as your four and your other, like, bigger presence in the lineup, is it necessarily going to help you very much against those two? He basically had to outplay them really on his own. It felt like 2-on-1 with those two on the court, and Mitchell Robinson was able to just baby them, right? He was more physically imposing. He was tougher. He's a little meaner, right? I think, obviously on social media, a little bit of an oddball, but honestly, I kind of like it. It's a little bit funny that he was born on April 1st. I feel like that just kind of lines up with who he is as a person. But, with that being said, I feel like I give him a B+. I thought he had a strong enough season. I know the injury situation wasn't great, but I felt like because of that Cavs series, I had to bump him up from a B to a B+. Is there a good argument for a B? Yes, especially when you have injuries. Like, obviously, you can't control that, but not being able to play games is something that hurts your team, and it asks your team to have depth. The Knicks always need to have a competent backup big, and that's because Mitchell Robinson's always a liability to get hurt. And, that's part of it. That's part of the downsides. Every player has their ups and their downs. Every player has their pluses and their minuses, and that's just one of Mitch's. And I think that's actually kind of a really good way to segue into our backup big situation. And that's with Isaiah Hartenstein. Now, if you asked us in like December, what is our grade on Isaiah Hartenstein? I think D-. He might have gotten the worst grade out of anyone in the video, right? But I mean, it's like he turned a new leaf. I remember it was he made a comment to the media where he's like, I have to be better, something along those lines, where, he was critical of himself and his play, and then he completely turns it around, right? The Knicks lose Mitchell Robinson. You're like, oh my God, we're going to have to start Isaiah Hartenstein. We are screwed. And again, context, guys, the Knicks were not well above 500. They were hovering above 500, kind of, a fringe playoff team. Maybe they'll make the play in, and lo and behold, Isaiah Hartenstein, new year, new him. He stopped trying to shoot as many threes. The shot just wasn't falling for him, focusing more on, establishing an interior presence. And I thought he did an admirable job as a Knicks backup center. And considering where the Knicks have been at with guys like Nerlens Noel, who, not saying Noel was horrific, but Noel was definitely an inconsistent big, the butter hands, just injury situations in general. Hartenstein was an Iron Man for the Knicks. If you needed him to play, he was ready to play. No matter how many minutes you needed him to play, he was tough. He was resilient. I felt like he was, not to the same extent of Josh Hart, because Josh Hart, I think had a larger impact, obviously, but that same kind of like gritty, like this guy would have played on the 90s Knicks type nature to him. I really liked what Isaiah Hartenstein brought to the table. You mentioned this before the episode. He's a young player. How did you feel about Hartenstein's role on the team? And I understand, grades are relative, guys. So if we give him, whatever grade we give him, it's not saying that, he's on the same level as like a Josh Hart or a Mitchell Robinson, but it's for his role and for what he did. I thought he was as good as you could ask for. What did you think about Isaiah Hartenstein this year?
Right, so, like you said, I mean, Hartenstein turned everything around pretty much when the calendar year started. I have a stat here. Since January 1st, he averaged 6.6 rebounds, 4.5 points, 1.6 assists. I know you read those stats and you go, oh, that's not a whole lot. For a backup center, you love that. 6.6 rebounds out of your backup big? That's awesome. I would take that every time. I know he started some games here and there, but, still, like, that's amazing. Quite frankly, for a guy who's a backup and only in his like third or fourth NBA season. This was a positive development year for Hartenstein, I think. He had a long-term withstanding role as the backup center. He wasn't like falling in and out of the rotation like he was in previous years in the league and with the other teams he was on. So for all that, I gave him like a B minus, and that's an overall season grade because, like we said, from October to December, it was rough for him. It was rough. Things were not looking good. He was kind of a cone defensively. He wasn't really getting rebounds. A lot of things just weren't going right for him. And obviously when Mitch was hurt, you had to rely on Jericho Sims more, who is a third string center, which we'll talk about Sims right after we talk about Hartenstein, but you know with that being said, just like you said, he made that comment and then he turned things around and then just like he became like a really good backup center, kind of night and day. I mean, he was really consistent too. It wasn't like he just had a few good games and then just kind of leveled off. No, he continued to do what he was supposed to do. He continued to play much better defense. He was hustling, getting good rebounds. Like you said, he was gritty. He was playing physical. He wasn't afraid to, fight for those rebounds. He turned it up a big time. He turned it up huge, and I am really happy with that, which is why I gave him a much higher grade than I would have if we were doing this rating back in December. Because if this was a October to December rating, like you said, this probably would have been like in the D kind of range, because it was rough for him. But I'm really happy with what he did. This was, like I said, definitely a positive development year for him. This was his first real, with the Clippers, he played really well, but I think this was, a big breakout type year for him in a way, because he really kind of showed what he's really capable of and kind of established himself as, a very, very solid backup center and probably one of the better backup bigs in the league now at this point. Even in the playoffs, he continued to do what he was doing, since January, the hustles, offensive rebounds, defensive rebounds, getting blocks. His defense really leveled up when after he made that comment. He really started to play better defense, and I'm really happy with that. Obviously he wasn't perfect by any means, no, but for what it was worth, you got the guy as a backup and you signed him for pretty cheap. And like you said, we had like Nerlens Noel last year, who was inconsistent, almost never on the floor, who had Taj Gibson play backup center. I love Taj Gibson, so I'm not going to rag on Taj Gibson, but, he was the backup center, and I mean, that's not really the options you want. You want a younger backup big. You want a guy who's a little more athletic. That's what they got out of Hartenstein, and quite frankly, I was really happy with it. He closed some games sometimes too. Hartenstein, I'm referring to here. He closed some games. That's how impactful he was. He wasn't always getting into foul trouble. He was doing pretty good at limiting that. He was good at, just walling up that interior and not letting those easy shots fall. Making it tough for opponents. Was really happy with what he did. He's for a backup big. I was pleased with it. What do you think about all that?
Yeah, no, I think you put it perfectly. Like, he was just exactly what the Knicks needed. Considering that, as you mentioned too, with Nerlens, well, it was a matter of not being available at times, especially when you already have Mitchell Robinson, who's an injury threat. You need to have a reliable backup big. And we're going to talk about Sims in a second, and that's still something we want to cover. But, Taj Gibson, I'm glad you dropped him. We talked about this before the episode. We were going to name drop him. We needed to name drop Taj Gibson. His threes were, they hit different. But, not having to go to your third string center, because your backup big is out is huge. And as you mentioned, Isaiah Hartenstein's ability to close games, the Knicks, weirdly enough, they were, again, 108.2 offensive rating with him off the court, 110.2 with him on the court. So, plus, he was a plus offensively in terms of just plus minus. Obviously, that's not a perfect number. But with that being said, you just want your backup big to, number one, positively impact the game. But, or you could say even number two, positively impact the game. Number one is just stay healthy, right? Just be available, be there. You're a backup for a reason. You're there to, help the team if the starter goes down. And that's exactly what he was able to do. I felt like he really evolved into his role, and he's young, as you mentioned. He just turned 25. Like, this is a guy who's not an old player
and
at all.
Too, I just want to add too, the fact that he was one of the few players in the league that played all 82 games. There is a small handful of players that did that, and Isaiah Hartenstein was one of them. Just like you said, the availability, the impactful play, of course, is awesome, but just the availability is huge, especially out of your backup. That is huge. And the fact that he was able to play all 82, not even get hurt or anything like that, and battle through any sort of ailments he might have been battling through that we don't know about, I applaud that. I respect that a lot. I just wanted to add that a little bit.
Yeah, no, I remember that one game where he gets cut in the arm and you just see them patch it up on the sideline and he's right back in the game. Right? I don't know if you remember, he's bleeding out his arm and I'm sensitive to the blood. So I'm like, ooh, that's not good. And I mean, he's just a tough dude, right? And I'm not saying Mitch isn't tough. I think you have to be tough in order to do what he did in that Cavs series. But having two guys who I feel like are tough the way they're tough speaks volumes to this team, speaks volumes to how they're coached, speaks volumes to who they are as players. And I think the Knicks, we're noticing a pattern here. I think there is a pattern with the front office. I do think that they care a little bit, at least, about character. I think these are the type of things they scout for. Not saying that they'll go, all right, are you tough or not? And then it's like yes or no, and then that's how they sign you. But I do think that, to play for a Tom Thibodeau team, you have to have a little bit of edge to you. Randall, I know that, people chalk it up to just being an angry dude, but like he has edge to him, right? And I think that's why there is a lot of love from Tom Thibodeau for Julius Randle. And Hardenstein's a guy, he's just tough. He's always available. He's just reliable, right? He's just all reliable. I think that's the best way to put it. So I gave him a B on the season. It's hard for me to give him, I don't want to give him a B plus because, Robinson's the starter, right? Robinson played well in his starter role. So I'm just going to settle for a B for Hardenstein, but it's a good B. It's like a better B, not like a bad B at all. But with that being said, the last guy, and I don't think there's as much to talk about Sims because there wasn't as much of a need for Sims this year. Yes, there was a stretch where he was the backup big, but it wasn't too long of a stretch. Sims it felt like he took a step back from last year. I thought after his first season, like, you know what, the Knicks might have something here. There was a legitimate argument to be made that he could have been the backup big, that the Knicks maybe didn't have to sign Hardenstein. When Hardenstein was struggling, there were talks, okay, you trade Hardenstein and just make Sims the backup big. But, this year was kind of weird for him, whether it was inconsistent playing time, whether it was just, struggles. I felt like he wasn't the same. I felt like he wasn't the same defensive threat. I feel like it just was not a great year for Sims. So, what did you think about Sims' season? Do you think it's like an aberration? Like, what do you think is next for Jericho Sims?
Right, so Sims had a weird season, like you said. It wasn't anything crazy. He's a third string center, so you don't want to go too hard on the guy. He hasn't had a lot of time to develop in the NBA. He's only gotten so much playing time, but for what it was worth, like you said, he did feel like he kind of took a step back just a smidge. His defense was down. Offensively, not a whole lot, and they tried a Sims Hartenstein front court once, and that was the worst thing I had ever watched on a basketball court in a long time, so I'm glad they abandoned that. But, they did try it, and it was horrific. And that's not Sims' fault. That's, again, that's a roster construction issue. But, obviously Sims' limited offensive game is a big factor into why he doesn't play a whole lot. If I'm going to give him a grade for the season, it's going to be like C minus D plus range. It's not a high grade. I don't have a set grade on this one just because he didn't play a whole lot. I give him extra points for just, availability. He was available almost every time, and he was able to come into games, start sometimes, and, be the backup big especially when Mitchell Robinson was down. So I applaud that. He was able to do all that stuff, and he was able to, just, like I said, be available. And, he was in the dunk contest this year, and he did that awkward 50 thing. I don't know why he chose to do that. I still think that was kind of awkward. It just was pretty weird for him to do that. Sims is kind of a interesting guy as it is. Not saying he's awkward, but he's a pretty quiet dude. You don't really see much out of Sims. Kind of emotionless dude. So it was just even funnier. That was probably the highlight of the season for Jericho Sims. Unfortunately, for a guy who didn't play a whole lot. Yes, it's unfortunate. That's what everyone remembers him for this season. But if you look at it from a basketball standpoint, high flying dunker, is limited offensively. He can be good defensively, but I think there were still some things he needs to tweak on a bit. Shuffling the feet, wasn't really guarding good perimeter bigs that well. Third string big, like I said, you can't expect too much out of him. He needs more time to develop. That's just a fact. He hasn't played a whole lot in the NBA. Pretty sure combined in these last 2 seasons, he's played less than a full season. So he's still got time to develop. He's young. I'm not going to be too hard on the guy. But, if we're giving him a season grade, it's going to be like, a D plus type grade. It's not a high grade. It's just, I think that's fair. What do you think?
Yeah, and this kind of like plays into the fact that the center position is kind of weird for the Knicks in the sense of like, I feel like at the wing spot, like you have a guy like Quentin Grimes. You're like, okay, next year could be a big year for him. Even at the guard spot, like you could make a reasonable argument that like Miles McBride can take a step forward next year if he figures out his 3-point shot, right? For the center position, doesn't really feel like Sims fits into the long-term plans. He's only like a couple of months older than Isaiah Hartenstein. I believe he's like 24 and a half, and Hartenstein just turned 25. So, is it not like a situation where like Hartenstein's older than Sims and you're like, all right, maybe Sims becomes the successor to Hartenstein? I think you just keep Hardenstein. It's not like he's going to cost very much when you have to re-up that contract, or you just draft another backup big. And he doesn't space the floor, so it's like a modern type big situation, right? That's not what this is. So it just feels like an overall like a weird fit. I think I agree with you in the sense it doesn't feel like he has much of a future here. It doesn't feel like it's fair to grade him very harshly because of the fact he's not going to play very much. But I do agree. I think the grade range of like C-, D+ is fair. And I think that's kind of like the best way to put it. I don't really have much more to add on with Jericho Sims, but I guess kind of like my last thought here and last question here, going forward, do you feel good with the center position? Because right now I feel like the center position, you can kind of like leave it how it is, and I'd feel really good with it. Like, what do you think there are any tweaks they're going to make to the center position, or are you just good with running it back next year there?
Right, so center position's a little weird because, like you said, they could run it back again next year with Mitch and Hartenstein, and I'd be content with it. I'm not gonna be like upset about that, but I feel like in the offseason they will at least attempt to look to maybe find a big that can space the floor a little bit more, whether it is as the backup or a starter. I feel like they're gonna be more aggressive for a starting center, and that might be unfortunate for Mitch, but it could just be a reality. I'm not saying that's not a knock on Mitch. Mitch is a great player for what it's worth. It's just a matter of the fit on the team. Like we've talked about before, the floor spacing, it was a massive issue in the postseason. And it's not all attributed to Mitch, but it's part of it. If we're saying that he had no part in the floor spacing issue at all, then you're just wrong. You have three guys that specialize in scoring inside, being Jalen Brunson, RJ Barrett, Julius Randle, and Mitchell Robinson, who is a lob threat really offensively, and that's about it, right? So when you have that, you have four guys that, pretty much are their best scoring ability is inside and then just one shooter. That's not going to make good spacing at all. That is not going to create any good spacing whatsoever. And, quite frankly, the Knicks were haunted by that in the postseason. We saw the spacing was at times horrific. They couldn't get any good looks whatsoever. Again, not all Mitch's fault. Not at all. Not all Hartenstein's fault. No, it's not all their fault. It's roster construction, and I think at some point they may need to consider, looking for bigs that can floor space a little bit, just to kind of fit them into today's modern NBA. In today's modern NBA, most teams are kind of straying away from that traditional big and relying on their bigs to not only score more but also shoot a little bit, whether it's mid-range or 3 points, whatever it may be. They're looking for them to score a little bit. Mitchell Robinson's play style is obviously a little more old school. He's the inside guy, the lob threat who gets a lot of block shots and all that, plays hard defense. You love that. That's an impactful player, but at the same time, is he like the long-term answer? I don't know. And I'm not saying that that's like, a knock on Mitch again, but, I don't know. We don't know what it could be. There's clearly some sort of issue in that interior offensively. Defensively, it's awesome. I like that. Offensively, it's an issue, though. And it does have to be addressed if the Knicks really want to, take this team to the next level. Those are kind of my thoughts on it. What do you think?
I think spacing is just kind of like one of those things where the Knicks could do better in general, but getting a big who can space would change a lot for this team. Like, you look at this team in a different lens almost. It's not like, I don't want to like oversell, like I don't want to like make it like the Knicks would be like a finals contender with just some random center who can space, but a random center who could space would certainly change how the offense plays. And could also change, just a lot going forward. Obviously, big who can space is something every team could kind of use, with the exception of 76ers or whatever it may be. And obviously, 76ers are a little bit of turmoil, so that's obviously going to spur some rumors. But with that being said, I think that's a good place for us to wrap up, right? I think the center position overall, net positive. The Knicks got enough from there, but I think it was more of a floor raiser than a ceiling raiser for this team, if anything. Not saying that's a bad thing, but that's kind of what the position felt like. If there are any changes, it's not going to come in the draft, and it's not going to come with like some random dude. It'll have to be like a substantial guy in order for them to make an upgrade. But we'll keep our eyes focused on that. We'll definitely talk about different options. As the offseason carries on. There's definitely one guy we want to talk about, not in a positive way. But with that being said, thank you guys so much for tuning in. We appreciate you guys' continued support. If you guys like what we do, make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe. Check out our Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and of course this YouTube page. The audio version of this podcast is on Apple Podcast or on Spotify. And of course, you guys can check out our personal Twitter accounts. Check out Empire Sports Media for all your New York sports content. We have great articles out there all the time. And we'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.